everyone, I'm going to be going over how to composite sunbeams, or sometimes you might hear them called God rays, in Blender. So I have this file that's already set up with several different collections, and this is a really important part. I'm just going to switch over to the rendered view so you can see there are a few different materials. There is a cube that's animated going forward, and then I have a couple of planes here. Now the planes are very important. They're inside of the camera view, and these are going to be the source of my sunbeams or of my God rays. So those are in their own collection right here. And I do definitely need to keep that all in its own collection. All right, now I'm going to need to actually use multiple view layers. So up at the top, we have these different view layers. The default view layer has everything active. I'm going to click on the new view layer option. I'm going to create something new. I'm going to rename this, and this is just going to be what I need for the sun. And what I'm going to do in my original view layer, which is my default, I'm going to uncheck my God rays collection. Everything else is enabled, and then back over in my sun, I'm going to set this one up so that only the sunbeams and the camera are selected. So my cubes, my environment, they're all turned off. I'm leaving the camera and the light, and I'm leaving my God rays selected. So when I change back and forth, I have different collections enabled for my two different view layers. Now, I'm going to need to set up some different passes in my view layers. So in my first view layer for the whole, I'm going to go over to my passes, and I'm going to add a pass for the environment, but otherwise just the default should be fine. So combined and environment there. And in the sun, I shouldn't need any special passes enabled. The default should be completely fine. Now I'm going to go to my render settings. Notice I have the cycles engine. I've already set up most of my settings ahead of time. Just going to minimize a few of these things. Under film, I'm going to check transparent. So it's just going to be rendering the environment as its own pass, and otherwise my images are going to be transparent. That's something that is important. And that's something that's independent of the view layer. You'll notice as I change between them, it's checked for both of them, and that's the same. All of the scene settings will be consistent. Right, in the output settings, I have an output location chosen, and all I need to do is select the Open EXR multi-layer for the format, because that includes the different render layers, and it also includes the different passes. Now, I prefer not to render out the entire thing in one go. I'm just going to go maybe render frame 25, so something in the middle. And that is just entirely so that I'm not wasting my time rendering out my entire sequence in case I need to come back and make changes to something. So that is all set. I'm going to render the animation because I have the single frame selected. It's just going to render my two different layers. All right, and that is done. So you can see there's the transparent background, and it did render both layers. So from here, I'm just going to close out, save my file, and make a new one with Command N, new general file. I can ignore everything that's going on in the scene itself, and I'm just going to head over to compositing. Now on this side, I'm going to check Use Nodes. We have the composite here, which determines what's actually going to be in the output. And I'm going to get rid of render layers, so just X to delete, Shift A for the add menu, and I'm going to be adding an image node. I'm going to open my file, and we can see that the two different layers are there and visible. So I'm going to be adding a bunch of nodes to help combine everything together the way that it wants. First of all, I'm just going to duplicate my image node, maybe zoom out a little bit more so I can see them together. One is going to have my sun active, and one is going to have just the default view layer that has everything else in the scene. All right, I'm also going to add a viewer node, so that's Shift A to add. I like to search for the node so that it doesn't take too much time. Before I start connecting things together, I'm going to search, just Shift A, for alpha over, which is one of the different blending modes. All right, so I'm going to be connecting from combined to the lower image over here, and then from environment to the upper image socket. And on the right, for now, I'm just going to move this over to the viewer so you can see what's going on. If I remove the environment, I just have that empty background. It uses just the white color to start, but if I connect the environment socket, now it includes my world environment. All right, so that gets the environment all set up. Next off, I'm going to add another alpha over. So actually I can just duplicate this one. So Shift D to duplicate. And I'm going to connect it over here so that it's connected to the top socket from one to the next. I'm also going to connect from image to image over in the composite node because that'll make sure it's actually in the output. So I have just this empty white right now for the second image slot. And I'm going to use that to connect to my sunbeams. So for now, I'm just going to connect directly so you can see that everything is just getting combined together. Now, alpha over just puts things directly on top of each other based on the order of the socket. So if it's the upper socket, it's behind. If it's the lower socket, it's in front. So that's just something that's important to be aware of. And now I'm going to add several different nodes in between my sunbeam and this second alpha over. So first of all, I'm going to add, just with Shift A, sunbeams, and I'm just going to let that connect automatically. If it's not in the right place, I can try again, or I can manually connect from combine to image and from image to image. Now, there are a few settings here, and I do need to add some additional settings for this really to work effectively. But if I start increasing the length, you can see it's really changing how that's going to look. So I'm going to do a few different settings here. And so up top, we have sort of the size and the angle of the beams. So you'll notice that as you start changing the numbers, you're going to get a very different behavior. So like negative direction versus positive direction. So this first number is controlling more horizontally. The second number is controlling more of the vertical angle. So we can experiment with the different settings here to really have an impact on the exact angle that we're getting, both horizontally and vertically. So that's something that I can keep experimenting with. All right, next up, I'm going to add a blur. And you'll notice there are a bunch of different blurs. I'm just going to go with the default and connect it in between the sunbeam and the alpha over. And there are lots of different settings I can experiment with depending on how blurred I want this to look. But for example, if I want to increase the amount of blur on either the X or Y axis, that is something that I can do. I can play around with size. You can see that's starting to get more blurry. So it really depends on how crisp you want the edges of your sunbeam and how distorted you want that to be. So this can have a pretty big impact. You'll notice as you start changing the other settings, these also can have an impact just for the style. So experiment, see what you like the look of. I'm just going to leave the default. And so at this point, it's just a matter of, is there anything else that you want to tweak? There are a ridiculous number of nodes that you can experiment with depending on how you want your sunbeams to look. But this should get you a starting point. If you realize you want a few of them going at different angles, you could have an additional sunbeam view layer that you could set up and keep things a little bit more separate to have a little bit more individual control if that's something that you want to do. But generally speaking, when you have a situation that you're happy with, you'll just save the compositing file. I like to save with the same name, just with a C added to the end, so that I know which is the compositing version of the file. And it's really helpful to keep your compositing separate for a few different things. It really saves on processing when you're rendering from this stage. And then also it prevents you from unintentionally having the compositing override the original file or the reverse when you're trying to render one direction or the other. So it's just easier keeping things separate. It'll be better performance as well. All right, so I'm just going to head back over to the original file. Again, if there was any other setup that I wanted to do, I would change it at this stage. Like if I wanted to move where my planes are located, I could do that. If I wanted to add a second collection for sunbeams and then add another layer over here, again, to handle those individually, I can do that. But otherwise, as soon as I'm happy with everything, I'm just going to adjust the range of the animation to what I actually want to see, keeping it to a small number just so it doesn't take too long. It's actually rendered frame 25 already, so I'm just going to set that back to 24. And then from here, all I need to do is render the animation. All right, so that's finished. I'm just going to close out, save with Command S, and head back over to the compositing version of the file. Now, for both of the image nodes, I need to go to the little folder icon, A to select everything in the folder so that I'm getting all of my renders, and open image. I do need to make sure that when I do that, that the correct view layer is selected in each layer. So same thing over here, A to select everything, the order is already correct, open image, and then again making sure that it has the right view layer and that everything else still looks as expected. And if I do want to continue on experimenting with different settings, I can do that depending on what I end up wanting things to look like. So the different settings are going to honestly have just a huge impact on how things look. All right, and from here, I can just render to video. So over in the output settings, I highly recommend making sure that your resolution is exactly the same as in the original file. Want to make sure I'm rendering the correct number of frames. And I usually just render to the desktop, just so that it's easy to find. I want to change the format to video. I might want to change the encoding. And because it is largely just stitching the images together with some minor changes, rendering goes through very quickly when it's just doing the compositing. And already finished. When I go over to Finder and the desktop, here we go. And when we play through, you can see exactly what it looks like. So that is the basics of compositing sunbeams.